Hi everyone. So we're going to be looking at different short stories, and I wanted to give you some context for how stories work so that when you read and annotate, you'll know what to look for. So short stories have a setting, and so things to note: where is it happening? What time is it happening? What is the weather like? And what are the social conditions? And so, is it moving backwards to forwards? When we think about social conditions, we think about, is this told from the perspective of a person who's on the margins, or is it a person with a lot of agency and a lot of rights and privileges? With weather, and there's a whole chapter on teaching literature like a professor, reading literature like a professor about weather. So if it's stormy outside, it's because the character is having a lot of internal conflict. If it's bright and beautiful and sunny, we can see that this person is in a bright part of their life. And sometimes the weather disagrees with what's going on in the story. And that juxtaposition tells us to be suspicious of a narrator or of a character. Some people are really into history. We're actually going to get more into history with our poetry unit. But for right now, what you need to realize is that the characters probably live within the context of the rules of their historical time. So it's sometimes we look for things like, do they have technology? Okay, it's a modern story. Or are they, riding on horses? Because maybe it's a more old fashioned story. So anything that makes it really clear what historical period it is, besides the person telling us what the historical period is, can be helpful. And then finally, there are some things that we know about place that help us understand the characters in the story. Depending on where the story happens in the world, we get a sense of who and what is going on with the character. So a story that you'll be reading, maybe a character lives in a place that was colonized by another country. That does have impact on the characters and the story and the place sometimes. Okay, let's talk about plot. The introduction, right, is also sometimes called the exposition. And we think of this as when we meet all the characters in the story, and you'll get some sort of initial conflict. Usually the character will have some sort of internal and external conflict, because short stories are not plot driven, they're character driven. You'll also see some rising action. What that means is things will continue to go wrong and that conflict will build. The climax might not come at that perfect center page of the story, but it is where everything kind of falls apart. And then the falling action is where we see the after effects of all of those events. The ending, sometimes called the ending, can also be called the denouement. It's French for unraveling, right? And that's the final outcome of the story. Of course, we have conflict in stories, internal and external conflicts. Internal conflicts are inside the character, right? It might be thoughts, emotions, or beliefs. External is anything outside of their body, and that can be anything from bears attacking them to war to an argument with their sister to bad weather, right? And that's why we say character or nature. You may have heard of this before, and you can absolutely fast forward for 2 seconds. Human versus human, human versus some sort of circumstance like injustice, human versus society, human versus self. I really encourage you to look for these things in short stories, because short stories are very much character driven, not plot driven. What does that mean? That means that short stories are more likely to focus on a character and less likely to focus on like a larger, bigger plot that involves many characters, just because there's only so much room. Okay. How do we know what a character is or what they're like? This is a very silly image, I realize. How they look, right? That's why authors describe how they look, because often that'll give us hints. It's a very famous saying that in Shakespeare, old people and children always tell the truth. And so that idea of like how they look will give you a hint to what to expect from them. What they say, and sometimes that can conflict with what they're thinking. But if we have a limited narrator, which means we don't get to see what they're thinking, what they say is how we kind of pull our evidence for what kind of person they are, what they do, and what they think, right? Often when you write about a short story, you're going to analyze a character's actions. Adult stories, we don't get a ton of this is what I'm thinking at this moment, because it's very simplistic and childlike, right? In children's stories, people get angry, people have big feelings, people get sad. In adult stories, you get less of that. This is like a fast forward of probably everything you learned in middle school. There's lots of kinds of characters. If you have a complex, multi-dimensional character, you might call them dynamic, right? And sometimes they develop from kind of a real, fully realized individual to a dynamic character. The opposite of that is a static character. It's usually stereotypical with unchanging, one dimensional traits. Unfortunately, in many stories, these are the background characters. And in scary stories, those are the ones that die first, right? So you have the jock or the bimbo or the himbo or whatever, and they immediately die. Those are your static characters. And then finally, look for point of view in your story. First person point of view is found to be very confessional. Third person omniscient is usually when the narrator can tell us everything that they know, and they can read people's minds. Usually that doesn't happen in adult stories, right? Third person limited is more common. That's where we see from the outside what the person's doing, but we can't necessarily see what they're thinking. And then third person objective is like even more removed from that. So we don't get any thoughts from anyone. You'll notice maybe if you did a lot of grammar in junior high and high school, there's no second person. Second person, Lauren Goff pointed out, is incredibly uncommon and difficult to do. Not impossible, but writing a whole story in your is really something that we don't see very often, and I'm always on the hunt for a good one. So if you know of one, please let me know. Okay, we're going to circle back to theme when we do a play, but for short stories, if you find a life lesson or if you find a big idea that stretches through your whole play, and I'm not saying a metaphor that stretches through the play because that's a motif or a story. So if you have a short story and a cave appears over and over again, that's a metaphor, and a metaphor that repeats is a motif. The life lesson is what the cave teaches us, right? And that's the theme. It often reflects something about human nature, society, or life experiences, and it's that element of the story everyone can connect to. Oh, there's a repeat slide. Ignore. Okay, I hope you found this entertaining and useful, and I'm excited for you to be part of my class. And please let me know if you have questions, and I hope you have a good day.